Let me start, maybe Parminder, yeah? Introduce yourself. He's a very interesting background. He's now Chief Commercial and Digital Officer of Media Corp, which is our big broadcasting group. He's got a background in Twitter and basically digital media. So tell us what your thoughts are.
Sure. Thanks, Patrick. Patrick, you forgot to mention we gave up our jalebi to be here on time as well, right? So we were there in the same government. So as Patrick mentioned, my name is Parminder. I joined MediaCorp about 9 months back. I run the business and the digital transformation function. I've spent my life before that with mostly Silicon Valley companies. I was running Twitter for Asia. Before this, prior to that, I was with Google running one of the businesses for Asia Pacific. And before that, with Apple Computers. So, the operative words today in today's title. Now, there's no question in this title, but there are two words or two concepts that are, I think, very significant: the media and the diaspora. And I'll just take both of them and elaborate a little bit on both of them because they've undergone a similar trajectory in the last 10 years or so. And the transformation in both media and the diaspora has been nothing short of dramatic over the last decade or so. And I'll explain what I mean. So let's start with the diaspora first. So one lens through which you understand what a diaspora, and specifically in the context of India diaspora, is when we all go out. I moved to Singapore about 8 years back. Before that, I was living in India, right? So, but my exposure to what is the perception of Indian diaspora was through these very regular trips I would make to the US. Every 2 months I was in the US because I was working for US companies. And the two touch points you have is, the immigration officer and the taxi driver, right? You pick up a conversation. I love doing that. And, when I made my first trip, I think I was with Apple at that time in the 90s. At that time, the perception of diaspora was they thought that I'm a taxi driver and I've come here to look for a taxi driver job or something like that, right? That was 90s. After that, a few years forward into the future, they thought I'm one of those outsourcing workers. I work for a BPO or something and I'm here to take their job. Now, the last trips that I was making over the last few years or so, they thought I'm a senior executive or I have a startup and I can provide employment. That's how the conversations with the immigration officer or the guy who was driving the cab that I was in changed. I saw it changing over the last 2 decades or so. And that's how the Indian diaspora also has come a long way in terms of their position, in terms of how people perceive them, and consequently, the role and the responsibilities that the diaspora has. Right, so the diaspora has gone through a fairly big transformation. Earlier, it was all about sending cheap labor. Then it was all about financial remittances. Now, the Indian diaspora is at a position where it can actually seriously affect and change the perception of the country. The highest possible brand is the brand of a country. And diaspora is in a position now where it can actually make some important positive changes to the brand of the country. So that's the diaspora. I think there's been a dramatic shift in not just the composition of the diaspora, but the perception of the diaspora as well. Now let's look at media. Media, obviously, Patrick mentioned this. It's the change has been nothing short of profound. All the industries have changed, but media more so than any other industry. When I joined, before joining Google, I was with IBM, and just a little bit of a history. My dad is a computer old-time scientist. He used to feel very ashamed of his son being in sales, and he never could reconcile with the fact. But when I joined IBM, he was very happy. In his mind, IBM was this mainframe company, big company. When I told him that, hey, I'm quitting IBM to join Google, he said, are you serious? Are you leaving IBM to join a web page? In his mind, Google was a web page. But now we all know, 10 years fast forward, that it's a big media entity. And of course, as you said, it's eating our lunch. Media is no longer the preserve of a bunch of companies. You are media. We all are media. Because we all have access to social mediums, and media is co-created these days. Now, combine this concept, the change in media, with the change in the diaspora. And that gives the diaspora incredible powers to be able to change the perception of a company. So a diaspora is not just a body which sends financial remittance back to India, but it is in a serious position to change the perception of a country across the world. And I think that's an important aspect that I thought we should touch upon in this discussion.
Thank you, Parminder. That was an interesting couple insights on both media and the diaspora. Okay, I'm going to turn to Sonam next. I think we need a kind of a different perspective on this. It's similar. Okay. Would you like prefer to use the? She was asking me, how did she end up in this panel?
Yeah.
We just said we needed a bit of star power,
Yeah.
So, we in the media, we know how to get people come to our discussions, So, over to you, Sonam.
So good afternoon, and thank you so much, Patrick. It's a great honor to be here, to be a part of the Bharatiya Pravasi Divas, to perform here and share my music and the message that it carries. And of course, to share my views on the media amongst such esteemed media experts. I am a musician based in India, and certainly not an expert on the media or the diaspora, like my esteemed panelists. So everything I'm going to say here today, I'm going to say from a personal point of view. And to be completely honest, it would have been much easier to write a song and sing this to you, but I couldn't find a word that rhymed with diaspora, so that was a bit of a problem. I want to touch upon just a few things, a few thoughts that I have on the subject, and then perhaps, if you like, when we open up for discussion, we can discuss them in greater detail. In my adult lifetime, I have seen media and the way that it is disseminated change radically. From a single government-controlled TV channel and a newspaper every morning to instant news and entertainment on multiple screens all the time. We are now connected 24/7. But in the old days, people of Indian origin living away from home were hugely cut off and were only able to connect with their homelands when they got to see an occasional Indian film by buying a VHS tape or listening to songs on an audio cassette, and maybe if they were lucky enough to live in a place like Singapore, they got to see a Hindi movie or a regional film on the weekends. Some were able to buy magazines like Film Fair in India Today, but many weeks after their publications in India. Stories about India in the local media as well, outside of our country, were limited. As Parminder also said, access to media was controlled by a few gatekeepers who decided what was newsworthy and interesting. So they got to determine how to portray India to the rest of the world. And depending on which film, TV show, or newspaper one viewed, the world was often left with contradictory impressions of India. It was either perceived as a country with a thriving infotech industry, a third world nation plagued by famine and poverty, or it was portrayed as a primitive spiritual mecca with an exotic mystical culture and very bendy yogis. This means that foreigners who didn't know our country any better viewed Indians and members of the diaspora included as people who danced around trees, worked in call centers, and of course went home to sleep in slums. And unfortunately, even though this portrayal of India hasn't changed much, and I cite examples of movies like Eat, Pray, Love, where Julia Roberts comes to India to find herself, or The Best Western Exotic Hotel, or even a movie which cliched enough is titled The Call Center, the TV series, unfortunately, people are still trying to portray India in that light. Fortunately, the onset of multi-channel television and the internet has meant that anyone, anywhere in the world can access pretty much any form of media regarding any part of the globe. And thanks to that, the worldview of India is beginning to change. Also now, an NRI sitting anywhere in the world can access information about his homeland, get news and entertainment of his choice, rather than rely on a bunch of programming people or editors. The most dramatic change, however, has been Facebook, Twitter, social media, and Instagram. These are some of the many, many ways in which Indians all over the world have become a closer, better connected community, and this has created for the diaspora a gateway to India, A feeling of kinship and community, yes, but also very, very importantly, for the first time, it's given the diaspora a voice. And this has enabled them to take on a greater role in the workings of their homeland. And now members of the diaspora scattered across the globe can converse and express opinions on social forums and mobilize resources, which has made them much more expressive and assertive than they ever have been before. Take, for instance, how many members of the diaspora got involved in the elections, in the Delhi Assembly elections with the Aam Aadmi Party, and the role that social media played in the successful positioning of that party. Now, I may not be a big fan of the Aam Aadmi Party, but that aside, lots of diaspora got politically active and helped the Aam Aadmi Party come to power, and huge sums also came to them in donations. Similarly, the BJP built an absolutely amazing network of overseas friends of the BJP by harnessing this very power of social media. Lesser-known initiatives like the 1 Crore Farmer Fund, started by an NRI software engineer called Suresh Ediga, is helping Indian farmers from thousands of miles away. And crowdfunding campaigns through social media for NGOs in India are leading to NRI donations in the sectors of child welfare, education, rural development, and public health. The diaspora is truly, incredibly, using social media to make a change. And so now this brings me to the fact that while Twitter, and it's interesting again that you brought up Twitter, like I said, our views are very similar. Twitter, Facebook, and other social media have radically changed the way that the diaspora connects with India in a positive manner. Unfortunately, these social media sites have also become platforms that enable the spewing of hatred and venom and riling up of negative sentiments. A simple expression of an opinion can receive a frighteningly severe backlash. You can be threatened, trolled, and God forbid if you're a woman with an opinion, you can be sure that highly personal, offensive remarks will be made. So my question to everyone here today is that should this much freedom be allowed? Freedom to disrespect, defame, and disregard people and their opinions, freedom to instigate, and freedom to be offensive anonymously and to get away with it. Is it not possible that with all the technology available to us, filters be created to maintain a certain level of decorum and sanity? And perhaps that's why this laissez-faire aspect of social media worries me. It worries me how easy it is to create hatred sitting miles away, but not to be there for the fallout. And perhaps this is something we really, really need to think about as people as well when we use the social media and as the diaspora. How can we be less trigger happy when it comes to social media? And how can we act more responsibly for the good of our country? And given that we are the ones who are supposed to be the techies, I'm sure these filters are something we as Indians can create and lead by example. And speaking finally of being responsible, the last point that I would like to make vis-a-vis the media and the diaspora comes from being a musician and someone who's very, very proud of the rich heritage and myriad traditions of Indian culture. Someone who, as an artist, has a responsibility to protect that heritage. The medium of music and art is one of the strongest yet simplest ways to invoke nostalgia and connect to the homeland. And from my personal point of view, I feel that when it comes to promoting Indian art and culture, it's really important that the media, especially in countries, especially outside of India, go beyond a purely eyeball-driven approach. And I agree, while the primary vehicle of the spread of Indian culture overseas is Bollywood, and it does project India in a very, very positive light, I do, however, feel that the media promotes Bollywood above all else, and often at the expense of all else. India has such a rich cultural tapestry of music and the arts, and is so deeply rooted in its traditions that continue despite adversity. Admittedly, those traditions may not enjoy the widespread popularity of Bollywood, but they are not only important because they are a huge part of our tradition and history, but also because they influence mainstream culture and much, much more than any of us can imagine. For those of you who don't know, most evergreen Bollywood songs are either classically based or folk-based. And our musical traditions enjoy huge popularity, and our art traditions with global audiences worldwide. So it is my most earnest request to the media and the diaspora to support those forms, to write about those forms, and to invest in those forms. And so I say this to you, and I have someone sitting right in front who I say this to specifically. The next time you have a cultural event that you think of organizing, don't only turn to Bollywood. For if you won't expose the diaspora to all the other wonderful, rich forms of art in our country, then who will patronize age-old Indian art and cultural traditions and enable them to prosper? And in case any of you is looking for a good Bollywood singer, non-Bollywood singer actually, I think Raghu Dikshit's manager and my manager are both somewhere in the audience, so you can contact them. Thank you.
Thank you, Sonam. You see, I knew you would spice up the afternoon. But, you know, I wanted to say you didn't tell them about your media background. So you must tell them. So you're not just a singer and a musician.
So I have quite a sort of myriad of background. I went to art school. I trained to be a graphic designer. I joined advertising as a graphic designer. And in those days, they said, you're a graphic designer. You're not allowed to think. You just design ads. And I said, I'm sorry, that's not going to work. And so I said, I'll just become a writer. So after 4 years in art school, I became a writer within weeks of joining advertising, so I could be at the beginning of the ideation process. I worked in advertising for a few years. I worked in television as well. I anchored a few TV shows, which allowed me to travel around India. I test drove cars in one of the TV shows where I was like the Jeremy Clarkson of India. And I was a really good driver. And let me tell you, there was a male TV host that used to do alternate shows. And he had an accident, but the lady driver had no accident. So that's really important. And then I did theater and finally found my way back to music. And as I said yesterday, for some of you who may have been there for the session, Singapore helped me find what eventually became the Sufi Gospel Project, because I started to learn gospel with a teacher here. So Singapore is exceptionally special for me.
Wonderful. You see, you made the mistake, you know. You shouldn't have joined advertising. You should have come and joined the media. Yes. You would have made a
I'd be worried about where my lunch was coming from then.
Journalist. Anyway, okay, our next speaker is Dr. Rajamohan, who actually was a journalist and then went on to become an academic. So he's gone upstream or upwards. So, Dr. Rajamohan, over to you. Say a few words about yourself and what your thoughts are on
Just want to add that journalists get paid more than professors, so it's always...
You think?
Yeah, I know. No, I've been a part-time journalist. I mean, part-time, not part-time really. Sometimes in the newspaper, sometimes outside. But I've been a columnist on foreign affairs for nearly 3.5 decades, writing initially for The Hindu, and the last 15 years for the Indian Express. So that's my background. And I've also been in many think tanks. Now I run a small think tank in Delhi called Carnegie India, which is part of the Carnegie's global network. Carnegie has 6 centers, we are one of them. And I've also taught in Singapore in the NTU, and I've had a visiting affiliation with the NUS at the Institute of South Asian Studies. So journeyman, so...
No, that's not journeyman.
Okay.
That's a well-traveled intellectual.
Thanks, Pat. And I thought I'll just make 5 points. I mean, I think many points have already been made. So the first is, I think, the business model that Pat talked about. That I think technological transformation has fundamentally altered the way information, whether it's news or other kinds of information, cultural products, Sonam is here, that how they get produced and distributed, that is fundamentally altered within the last 10 years. I mean, there was something called HMV some point ago. I haven't seen those records anymore. The company has disappeared. You just download music on the internet today. The newspapers today faced initially competition from television, but today in India at least, the television and the newspapers are struggling to battle off the social media which has come. But India is a paradox in this case where the disruption is quite clear because India is still teaching itself how to read. There is still an explosion of conventional media because the literacy rates are going up now fairly rapid pace. So there's a massive expansion of newspapers in India, especially in the language domain. Soon I think India will have probably the Hindi newspapers, the Dainik Jagran or Dainik Bhaskar, bigger than the People's Daily. That the size of the North India, the Hindi-speaking audience is so large that actually we'll soon have the largest newspapers. But at the same time, you have a younger generation that's not urban younger audience that just walks past newspapers. At my home, I mean, I get about 12 newspapers because being a news junkie, you want to read, Delhi has too many papers. But my daughter and son used to just walk past. I mean, didn't even cast a glance on them because they were getting their information on the phone, just as you do your banking on the phone, just as you download your music on the phone, or just as you watch your movies on the phone. That today the mobile phone has become the platform on which much of this is going to be consumed. Meanwhile, the journalism of traditional kind is facing pressures from social media, where Facebook becomes the arbiter for which news comes on top, what does the algorithm do, which news is seen as priority, which news source gets in. So all news media today are tied up to the Facebook or Google. That this is a huge transformation. I think we're just at the beginning of that revolution. A lot of us will be dinosaurs. I mean, I think it's a question, but content, I think still production of content, whether music, whether it's analysis, that is going to remain, but how that gets produced and how the traditional platforms are going to cope with it and how the new platforms are going to change it, that is going to alter dramatically, and I think that disruption we have to deal with. Second, I think one case where, from the Indian experience and more recently the American experience, we in the media prided ourselves for being the fifth estate, or fourth estate.
Haven't got to fifth yet, we'll get there.
Yeah. I think this idea that somehow as the purveyors of information, as the gatekeepers of credible information, that we are the arbiters between the political leaders, the state, and the population. And that's where if you see the 80s, 90s, the Indian power of the Indian media dramatically grew, the newspapers. But today, Mr. Modi doesn't even look at the national media. He doesn't bother to take him when he goes abroad. He has not given a single press conference. He tweets. He's got one of the world's largest followings on Twitter. Maybe millions of people who follow him on Twitter, probably one of the top guys in the world. And I think we've seen that in the case of the United States as well, where Trump actually doesn't give a damn to the mainstream media and says he can directly reach people. So the idea that we are the arbitrators, that we decide what's good for the people, that I think is breaking down, and the worse the business model gets, it's going to be far more difficult for us to think we are somehow the arbiters for state, between the state and the people. That's the reason why it was called the fourth estate, but today that position is going to be fundamentally shaken. A third level, the international dimension of the media revolution that is taking place. Remember when Hillary Clinton announced the so-called Internet Freedom Project, the idea that you can use the media to promote freedom, most probably in China and Russia. And now we are told Russia has manipulated American media to win the election for a guy who's a complete outsider. So are the tables being turned? Is today Russia and China, now we are told China has this huge influence, political influence all across. So this idea that somehow the democracies are going to do this, spread this gospel to other countries and undermine authoritarian states. Now we've seen actually the state is back. The state's capacity to use modern forms of communication, to influence, to put down domestic opponents. China has built a great wall. It's an example for a lot of countries, how to block internet. People today are talking about a fairly openly a splinter net, where a lot of countries are going to create their own net, which China and Russia are talking about fairly aggressively. So there is, I think, that question of how does it shape international relations? The traditional assumptions, the technological revolution is going to lead to a democratic utopia where every citizen has the right to do things. That today we've seen how the state can use the same technology to control, to surveil, to spy on you, to do all kinds of things. So there is a huge challenge, and I think those issues have not been sorted out. Coming specifically to India and India's foreign policy, how the new media has helped. In the morning you heard the ambassador praise our foreign minister. She's on Twitter most of the time. So one of you says, look, my passport is lost. Can you just help me? At Sushma Swaraj or at Minister EAM's office, there Mr. Javed Ashraf gets a message saying, please get this thing done for this guy. So you're talking about 180 embassies, 180 Indian missions that the minister today is accessible to the Indian communities, both within and abroad, in a manner that we've never seen before. It was an elevated, the guys were all in suits and rarely approachable by ordinary people, but today they're talking about the foreign, the entire foreign policy machinery today dealing with diaspora or the population's problems outside your borders or inside your borders has become a major function. So therefore, the use of social media to connect with people, I think Sonam talked about it, how the diaspora today can use the social media. Because already you've seen in India in the last 10, 15 years, films are being made for the diaspora. Yeah. Films get released in London and New York simultaneously. So it is the market that talks. That diaspora is rich, therefore making films exclusively for foreign content. I mean, beautiful foreign locales and all that stuff. And there are no flaws in the characters, it's all nice. So therefore, but the fact is that it is the market size of the diaspora that has already produced an effect on the cultural production within India. But that's one part of it. But the larger story is what Sonam said, that today the diaspora is not just a bridge, that it can actually participate and shape the Indian political opinion. That if you look at the Twitter today, the number of outsiders today, outsiders means non-residents, who influence the domestic debates, who write columns in the thousands of publications that we have. So it's not just what do you say, Bharat Mata ki bacche hain, bahar hain. It's not that. I mean, it is anymore that the capacity of the diaspora to influence internally and the weight of the motherland on the diaspora, both have changed fundamentally. So I think there again, we're at the beginning of a revolution, I think how that plays out. But I want to end on a cautious note, that Indian diaspora has dramatically expanded. First in the first wave of globalization in the 19th century, when Indian labor, Indian capital moved all across under the umbrella of the British imperial rule. And in the last 50 years, when the West and a large part of the world had open borders. So the Indians moved in different capacities at different times. But today I believe one of the problems that we're going to deal with, the borders are going to close. Just as Trump talks about building a wall in Mexico, there's a border where Trump says, look, H-1B, many Indians can go home. So this is going to be a Gulf. If the Gulf oil prices remain low, we have 7 million Indians in the Gulf. So you're going to find a situation that the kind of open borders that Indians enjoyed in the world, that is going to be constricted in the coming years. And there I don't think I'm one of those who says, look, I can't tell the American government, look, I have a right to work in your country. Why are you stopping me? That's the case the American companies can make, Google and somebody else say, look, we need the Indian engineers. But it's not a case as an Indian can make, look, I have a right to work in your country. But I think there's problems that the way the Indian media reacts to the problems the diaspora has. If you look at the Indian media today, you think we have a right to work and Trump is taking away that right. But I think the borders are going to close. One of the problems of globalization that's going to take place. So how the media, the new technologies, the diaspora and India interact, I think are going to face a new situation. I think in this, the traditional media certainly will have to play a more responsible, more balanced role of understanding what is changing in the world. How to redefine the relationship between India and the diaspora and the media, not in the conventional means, or more recently the aggressive use of media to promote political influence or other things, to one where we have to adapt this technology to taking a more responsible approach to the nature of India's changing relationship with this diaspora.
Thank you, Rajamohan. Excellent. Yeah. Before I pass on to Ravi, I just want to touch on that last point he made. By the way, all the points are excellent about social media and the diaspora. Can you imagine the diaspora without social media and without the internet? You'll all be sitting there waiting for the Times of India to come to you by the post. It wasn't very long ago, by the way. Anyway, no, this last point about borders being closed. My father came to Singapore from Kerala in 1930, because he couldn't find a job. He came as a 20-year-old, couldn't find a job. And I think India has had 70, 80 years of good fortune because your world borders were open, When the borders start closing, you better be able to produce enough jobs for Indians. Otherwise, you're going to have social revolution, in the country. You can't go to the Gulf anymore. You can't go and get H-1B, on passports, visas. And then you really have, because you have a very young population. So if you don't produce enough jobs, and you've got to produce jobs when technology is, sort of making them, sort of irrelevant, some of these jobs. So it's going to be a very tough time, for India. So thanks for that caution. Okay, Ravi Vellore, I just want to tell one story to Sonam before you say. One day I was in the car with him, and he was playing some music, and I said, "What's that music?" And he said, "It's a band called Indian Ocean." And I thought, wow, that's a great. So I went and bought the albums, Indian Ocean. And then, as serendipity would have it, Indian Ocean actually came to perform in Singapore at a 50th anniversary of a company set up by an Indian in Japan, who then moved to Singapore. So he brought his whole group together in Singapore for the company's 50th, a company called KB. And the founder is a chap called Kumar Chand. And he brought Indian Ocean to perform. I tell you, it was the best company event I've ever been to, The whole floor was dancing, like all Indians do, They just stand up and dance, So don't worry about Bollywood, We know, when we see a good performer, good musician, we at least the diaspora. I don't know about the rest of, but the diaspora understand. Okay, Ravi, over to you.
Thank you, Pat. The best way to describe myself is to say that I work for Pat. But that aside, I've been in journalism for about 38 years now. I began with an Indian Vice Service for a couple of years, then I worked for AFP, Time Warner. Then I came to Singapore in '93, went to Bloomberg after that, after working 7 years with the ST. And then Pat got me back, and he said, "Why don't you go to India?" And we opened a bureau in India. I think it was, rather reopened a bureau in India. And since then, the ST has tried to give 1 page a day to Indian coverage, at least when I was there. I'll tell you a couple of anecdotes because I'm essentially a storyteller. Back in the early 80s when I used to work for AFP, the news file would not move during the day. There's nothing. So I used to close the bureau at night, being night editor, and I used to panic. Nothing happened today. So I used to take the Press Trust of India feed, and invariably there would be accidents around India. So I'd do a story saying 24 people died in 6 accidents across India. And that would be published in South China Morning Post, Straits Times, and all that. But that was the news that was coming out of India. But what happened was closer to the year 2000, when the Y2K bug became thing and Indians got to be used, the perception about India began to change in the world. And it is the software boys who changed that for us. And with that, foreign news coverage of India began to change. Today, Bloomberg and Reuters, they have more than 30, 40 people working there, 20 in Bombay, 20 in Delhi and all that. So that's the level of interest. So when I went back to cover India, I thought I knew the place fairly well. But my biggest problem was reporting to the diaspora, because I had a very critical diaspora reading me, because they were very well informed, they were very well connected, and the challenge was to tell them something new. So it happened that since I know a bit about global macro and all that, during the global financial crisis, ST asked me to come back and work out of the Singapore office for a couple of months. So I was doing that. I had not written a word about India. But one Sunday, I get a note from a man called Mr. Mittal. And this note is copied to 40 people, all his friends, I assume. And it began by saying, every Saturday I opened the ST to see what Ravi Veloor has done to damage my country's reputation. And he says, you know respect for your country, you're too critical, you only see the bad things. And he ended by saying, I'm sure you had a very unhappy childhood. So I didn't know how to react to it. First, you're angry. Then I calmed down. Then I wrote him a long letter back, copied to all the 40 people. I said, look, Mr. Mittal, I've been back in Singapore for the last 6 weeks, and I've not written a word about India. The only thing close to India written about is on Bhutan, which had a change. The king stepped down and the new king came up. But I understand that when you're overseas, you're very sensitive about the way your country is portrayed. I grant you that. And stuff that you would accept at home in your own papers, you don't like to see in print elsewhere. And typically what happens is they come back and say, you only write good things about China, why bad things about India? So I said, look, you must take pride in the fact that you come from a country, a faith, and a civilization that is founded on the concept of truth. You must be able to accept that. So he wrote back to me, this time without copying the 40 people. And he says, look, I'm very sorry for my note to you. It is not in our culture to write these things, and I shouldn't have done that. I said, fair enough. But what I'm saying is, the level of scrutiny about the way India is reported has changed a lot, and you have to be mindful of that. And since Piyush is in the room, I want to tell one more anecdote. Back in '99,
being in the news, sitting there, Piyush, it's all the energy is going that way.
So this was my first stint at the ST, and I used to work on the financial desk. And my money desk editor was a man called Alvin Tay, obviously Chinese. And DBS one day put out a press release saying that they'd hired 7 managing directors. So I looked at, before your time, I know you wouldn't hire so much. So I looked at the list, and there were 6 names, some Amos, some Chinese, and 1 Indian. So I told the sub-editor to headline it, 6 new chiefs, 1 Indian. Next morning, my God, phone calls coming in, you racist paper, this, that, and the other. Alvin Tay got into a funk, said, Ravi, what have you done? I said, please tell them that a mama fellow told the desk to write this headline. So, I'm just giving you a sense of how prickly people can be about how their communities are, portrayed in the media. And since you asked me to speak about challenges, and this is really one of the big things, to write to a very informed, prickly, sensitive, well-connected audience. So I'll just stop there, Pat.
Thank you, Ravi. Yeah, he's a great storyteller. I must tell you this story about, this is a legendary story about Ravi Veloor and his shenanigans. During the Bombay terrorist attack, 1 Singaporean was shot and died in the hotel. So he was our bureau chief, and so he had to go in, he had to confirm this story. So what he did was, he put on his best suit. He went to Bombay, went very early in the morning, and he didn't pretend. He just walked as if he was from the embassy. He just walked in, said, I want to see my Singaporean, sort of fellow Singaporean who died, and he actually saw the body. And then, of course, all hell broke loose. Oh, you misrepresented yourself. He said, no, I just wore a nice suit. Journalists never wear nice suits, obviously. Anyway, thanks. Thank you, Ravi.
Clear for the record, I never said I was from the Singapore embassy or anything like that. I mean, it is true that I did dress well. And I know that people in India, they respect you if you dress well. But the other thing was that I said very early. I'd say at 5:45 in the morning because I knew the media would show up at night. But that aside, there was a personal side to it. My wife's cousin, who was chairman of Yes Bank, a man called Ashok Kapoor, was shot. And his body was also there. So I could also say that I have a relative.
Anyway, so we've covered quite a bit of ground. I want to reserve at least some time for questions from the floor. But Parminder, I want to come back to you because you can perhaps give us the best sense of what's ahead, you know? Where are we headed from here? My sense of it is that most people, at least I tell my young people, you know, when they hold their heads, you know, and said, my God, you know, the media is dead, you know, I mean, there's no more future for us. And I sort of said, hey, listen, it's going to change some more. What's happening now is just, you know, the beginning. I think it's going to change. I think the legacy media is going to come back. I'm not sure exactly how, so I was going to ask you whether you can tell us, you know, looking at your crystal ball, where do you see it go?
Yeah. So is this working? Yeah, it looks like. So first let's talk about the challenges. I think the biggest challenge, and at a very personal level, the thing that that dismays me a bit is the fact that journalism or marketing has got crystallized down to just sound bites, right? Which is a problem, right? If you look at the new generation, any long form text is something that they find very daunting. So that's now, we don't know what impact will this have in terms of how the new generation thinks, their power of comprehension and cognition. So I think that's a problem. And it's not just restricted to media, but generally. In fact, my wife and I have been so perturbed by this that we actually started a magazine here in Singapore called Kids Parade. It was for the kids, by the kids, just to get them to write more and read more. I told her that this is not going to make money. I can tell you that. It's a print magazine. It's not going to make money. But it's a passion project, so go ahead and do this. So I think that's a problem. And we need to figure out, A, what's the long-term impact of this? B, how do we make sure that we get the new generation, the kids, back to reading long-form text and not just Instagram bites or tweets or little Facebook posts. I think that's really important. There is a school of thought which says that the intelligence that would be required going forward would be very different, and hence don't worry about it. I don't think so. A lot of people often quote Socrates way back that, when writing you had scribes. And Socrates said that I'm not going to resort to writing because writing means devolution of human thought. He used to believe in dialogues, just oral, right? So that's why it's Socrates dialogues, right? So people say that media changes, don't worry, things will be fine. I'm not sure about it. So that's the part that worries me. But I think the opportunity lies in the fact that two things. One is co-creation is going to come up in a big way. No longer would media, content creation, storytelling would be the domain or the preserve of one or two companies here or there. And I think there's opportunity there. Now, right now, because we are in the middle of a huge, massive transition, it looks very cacophonic. Right? Everybody can say whatever they want on social media, whether it's Twitter or whatever, and it just looks chaotic. But I think channels will develop. Companies like us are thinking of ways and means to develop the power of crowdsourcing to develop content. We are trying to see how artificial intelligence can be harnessed to collect meaningful content from the masses, crowdsource it, and present it in a way that's palatable, that's readable for our audiences. So I think that's really definitely an opportunity. The second thing is that storytelling will exist, channels may or may not. It's very important for legacy companies like ours to recognize the fact that no longer can we say that we are a radio company or a TV company or a newspaper company or even an internet company. It's about storytelling. So as long as you stay true to the DNA of storytelling, you have to figure out the best way to tell that story, use the latest communication and channels available to you, but storytelling will say. And I think that's something that we feel very good about. We are trying various ways and means of trying to see how can we merge internet and television and radio and print together to tell a story which is told across all these mediums. So no longer can we think of a drama only for our television or only for Channel News Asia or Channel 8 or radio. We have to think of a story and then figure out how do we tell that story across all the mediums available. So I think there are some great opportunities, but there are some challenges as well that we have to figure out collectively.
Thank you. Okay, 10 minutes more. 3:30. It says 10 minutes there. Can you stay for 10 minutes? Yeah. She's got to go for her sound testing because she's performing tonight as well. So, first hand is up there, second hand there, third hand over there, fourth here. Okay, 4 questions. That's all I have time for.
Vocal audience.
You've got to be quick with your questions. Just tell us who you are, where you're from, and your question in 20 seconds.
Thank you. I'm Srini. I'm based in Singapore. My question is, as a member of the diaspora, we look for news. But what we always get is breaking news and opinions. So how do we think the diaspora can get fair news?
Fair, okay, good.
News?
Fair news.
Okay, that's
Yeah.
the first question. Next question is the gentleman behind you. Yeah. Oh, no. Yeah. This gentleman, yeah. Oh, he was first. Okay. Well, he's the policeman.
Sorry, it will be short because... it
Quick
is
question,
related
say
to-
who you are and what's your question?
My name is Seshu. Related to fake news, but more towards the lawmaking of related to fake news.
Sorry, what?
What's the question?
Sorry, I didn't get the question. What is the law?
Lawmakers, actually what I...
What's the response to fake news?
Personally
Okay.
felt is there is a lack of having a lawmaker here. And the response, I wanted to hear a response from a lawmaker about the fake news.
Fake news. Okay, good point. This person here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Sriram. This was something you ended with a comment, Dr. Raja Mohan, about traditional media has to become more responsible. As a diaspora, I also want, and it's related to these questions, to have an Indian point of view. One of the things that worries me about media is private ownership. If I look at large media houses, they are becoming privately owned and their agendas seem to be different. As an example, for the last 1 year, I have been following CGTN, China Global Television Network. It is projecting it looks global, it's projecting China soft power. Should the Indian government consider something like that?
Okay, good point. Last. Yep, then we'll take.
Hi, my name is Hari. I'm an avid reader of Straits Times for the past over 20 years. It's kind of related to
Thank
what
you.
Mr. Ravi Vellore said about Mr. Mittal's story, right? So I've always noticed there's a bit of negative portrayal of Indian political and social issues only in Straits Times. My question is in that context. But lately, with the present government, it has gone a couple of notches above that negative portrayal. So the question I have is about...
When you say it's gone more negative?
More negative. So the question I have is it because, as you were pointing one point, there are a lot of media does it in India, so why does it become a big issue if we do it here? Because when you get a one page, and if you cover 2 or 3 stories, and if most of them are in that, then it makes a big difference, right? So is it because the news feed you get from those sold pseudo-liberal medias, or is it your own personal ideologies? So that's my question.
Okay. Who wants to start first? Maybe, yeah. Any of the questions that you addressed?
I think there was a question on India's soft power. I mean, look, my sense is, look, I've long articulated that, look, India needs an international platform that would deliver news and information about India. Like CGTN, Japan too has one, what's called Cool Japan. There is, I mean, you name it, I mean, everybody has it. But I think for India, in the longer term, that model is unlikely to work, I think. As someone who's in India, I mean, I don't know if I'll trust the Doordarshan or All India Radio to do that kind of a thing of actually projecting. in the end, I think, like in the US it happens with private sector media. In India, it will have to happen with someone who has the capacity and the vision to do that kind of a thing. And I think, unfortunately, that has not happened. But in a more broader sense, soft power, when it is projected by the governments, is always suspect. I mean, so I wouldn't lose too much sleep that China does it because, CGT, and I mean, I'm sure they can get a lot of, a projection, but in the end, it has to be genuine to be believable at the end. So I'm not really worried about India not having a platform at this time. Second, I think in terms of the responsibleness, that when you today open channels in India, you have 60, 70 channels. I mean, people are just watching it for entertainment. So in the end, there is room for a credible source. I mean, I think eventually someone who can build a business model, because without that it's not going to work, that you have a business model that supports the collection and dissemination of credible information. They're going to do very well. I mean, I think who can produce that framework that will eventually get us there, of course, remains to be seen. But I think that's going to be critical because there's so many sources and so much noise that there will have to be some organizations that's going to do it, and that is going to do very well, but we still are not far from a business model getting us there.
Okay, thank you. I can take two questions. One is reporting, facts versus opinion, and the other one about fake news. Facts versus opinion is a very, very important point. What's happened in the media, especially in American media, is that before they tell you the fact, they tell you the opinion on the fact. So you are reading a story for the first time, and it's already embedded, with their opinion. So it's already a very, I won't say bias, but a point of view, sort of, the facts are wrapped in that point of view. So what we've been trying to do when I was the editor-in-chief, I said, look, tell me the facts first. Tell me the story. And you want to write an opinion piece, write a separate piece. Then at least people know the facts and then can come to their own conclusion. I think we need to get back to that. I don't see it happening in the US because it's becoming worse and worse. If you watch Fox, you get a completely different point of view. You watch CNN, you get another point of view. So that is the problem that the media has to address. Let me just state that. Yeah? On fake news, you are so right. We've got to do something about it. The law has to step in somewhere, because really, if you put out a blatantly false story about people, I don't see why, if you said that in the mainstream media, you get sued for defamation. But when you put out a false story online, it's okay, So, but you might have read that France is considering it. Singapore just set up a select committee to look at how the law should move. So it's going to happen. Your last point, I'll let Ravi.
Which was about?
Which was why we're getting more negative on India, he thinks.
Well, I used to be foreign editor before I became associate editor, and I ran that desk for 3 or 4 years. And, I can tell you it's not a conscious thing. It happens because, unfortunately, bad news is good news. And India does produce an overwhelming lot of bad news, or rather good news that's actually bad news. But the thing is, you have to see it from perspective from what it was 30 years ago, what it was 20 years ago, and what it is today. And today you'll find that there is actually a lot of good news that comes out. It's just that, as I said, when you're overseas, you're hypersensitive. What you would accept in Hindustan Times and Times of India somehow is not that palatable when you read it in the Straits Times and you're living overseas. But I can tell you there's no conscious policy to give bad news. But it does happen that, what you pointed out is true, that about 80% of the stuff that gets into the papers is from the wires. And it's, they supply the news. And, our correspondents, we have them in plenty. It's a growing bureau. And we're actively working on it. And you'll see by the end of this year, our network of foreign correspondents would have expanded, and you will see us doing even better on this front, because we will talk to you with our own eyes. When I was foreign editor, I used to have one mantra for my bureaus. I said it's important to be skeptical, but never be cynical about a country, because we're all developing countries, and we cannot be approached with the same yardstick as you might approach Europe or America. Hopefully, and I suppose most of them did follow what I said. Thank you.
One thing I found out is that the diaspora are incredibly patriotic.
Yeah.
They have such thin skins when you criticize India, which is a great thing. Yeah, which is a great thing.
I think that
Last word is
I
yours.
haven't ever read what Ravi says, but if you live in India and you watch a news channel in India, I can assure you his will be better reporting, because in India, the debates, all they do is shout at each other, and there's only negative news. No, they haven't. Those are the ones the TRP ratings rise. I'm not referring to Arnab. I'm not referring to Arnab. I'm just trying to tell you that as an Indian living in India, when we switch on the TV, it's all you see is negative news. However, there are great websites which have been started on social media, like the Better India website, where they only report the great stuff that's happening. So I'm sure there will be many more websites that are coming up, but like he said, there is a huge amount of bad news that does actually occur every day. So I think it's really important that that's reported, otherwise we'll live in a bubble.
Okay, I must wrap it up. I promised I'll finish at 3:30. I overran by 10 minutes because I was looking at the clock here and they gave us...
1 minute, 18 seconds.
Yes, 1 minute, 18 seconds. But will you please join me in thanking our panelists? I think they've done a great job. Yeah?
Thank you once again, Mr. Patrick Daniel, Mr. Parminder Singh, Ravi Veller, Dr. C. Raja Mohan, and Sonam Kalra. Can we give them a big round of applause, please? Kicking off media and the role of the diaspora. Our second panel is ready to join us on the stage in just a few moments. May we please invite you to remain in the ballroom. Please sit back and relax. Thank you very much.